Welcome to a Mick, a Mook, and a Mike.
Hosted by four-time Emmy-nominated producer
Frank Pace. And retired New York City firefighter, 9/11 first responder, and Vietnam vet, Billy O'Connor.
Today's guest,
retired General Counsel for Vienna's International Atomic Energy Agency, Laura Rockwood.
Today's interview with International Atomic Energy expert Laura Rockwood was a really important one. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties in the beginning of the episode, and therefore we had to ask the same question twice. Laura's answer to the question were both excellent and had slightly varying information. I chose not to remove the answers nor the questions. Please bear with us. I think you'll find the information to be extremely pertinent to the time and to be exceptionally important. Please enjoy.
oh my God, look who it is.
Surprise
Look who
myself
it
even.
is.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we
Great.
can.
Loud and clear.
Excellent.
We're live. We are live from the Honeycup Coffee House and Creamery with Billy O'Connor and meet Derek Harris.
Hello.
Hi, Derek.
Hello, Laura. Pleasure to know you.
Laura
Nice to
Rockwood.
meet you.
So I think I'm just going to read your introduction because I can't get all the words right. So I'm just going to read it. Laura is retired from the International Atomic Energy Commission as a section head for non-proliferation and policy making in the Office of Legal Affairs. During her employment with the IAEA, she was senior legal advisor on all aspects of the negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of IAEA safeguards, and was the principal author of the document which became the model additional protocol. She participated in high-level negotiations on Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and in the IAEA U.S.-Russian Federation negotiations on the Trilateral Initiative and the plutonium. I can hardly even read this. Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement. She is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nuclear Proliferation. Non-proliferation. So what does that all mean, Laura? Can you tell us?
So 40 years career in the nuclear non-proliferation area. For 28 years, I was the senior legal officer for the IAEA on safeguards. We negotiated the international treaties on safeguards. When questions came up about the IAEA's authority to carry out inspections, I was the one who answered those questions. So I've had, as I said, 4 decades, hard to imagine, but 4 decades of experience in this.
Wow.
My first question would be, Laura, the difficulty there must be when you're negotiating with people in the Middle East, considering you're a woman. Is that a big handicap?
Absolutely not at all. I have never, ever felt disrespected by, I've negotiated with the Iraqis, the Iranians, the Saudis. I've never been treated with anything but the utmost respect and not patronizing, but they understood that I was the lawyer that was part of the team. And so, that was the person they had to deal with. In Iran, certainly I was required, as are most women, to be covered, but not in any other location in the Middle East. And again, totally respectful.
Let me hang on a second. Derek, are you getting interference?
Yeah, I have no idea what that is. Hold on, let me just check it. I just checked
It does sound like there's something in the background.
Oh, it went away for a second. There, it's gone away again.
That's so strange. Okay. All right.
Now, Laura, did you go to Iraq in 2001 to see whether they had nuclear bombs or nuclear? If they had the ability, they had nuclear items,
Capabilities.
and did you? Yeah, and did you report back to President Bush that they had none?
Oh, actually went there in 2002. The IAEA had been, in effect, removed. It had removed itself from Iraq in 1998, and we weren't allowed to go back in until 2002. And yes, I was with the team that went back to Iraq to try to ascertain whether Iraq had reconstituted a nuclear weapons program. And by early 2003, it was pretty clear that they had not. And indeed, we reported that to the Security Council, to the Bush administration as well. And we also pointed out that some of the information the U.S. was relying on in order to justify an impending invasion was false intelligence. And the fellow who's the head of our action team, Jacques Boat, was the guy who figured out that the Niger documents were fakes. And to Mohammed El-Baradei's credit, he told the Security Council and the U.S. administration exactly that. Sadly, it didn't stop the invasion.
Unbelievable.
It is.
So they never did find nuclear weapons, obviously, in Iraq, right? I mean, they had the capabilities, though?
No, they actually had constituted a program, but they never got so far as even to have the nuclear material that was necessary for a weapon. They were carrying out a lot of small scale research into what you need for a nuclear weapon. And you need not just the nuclear material, but the whole industrial process of how do you turn it into a weapon? How do you deliver it? And Iraq never reached that stage.
Or when you guys went into Iraq to look, you didn't find any nuclear activity. I mean, they didn't have the capabilities of making a bomb. And my first question, the big question, is between enrichment and weaponization. How can you guys tell the difference if they're just trying to get your uranium for your enrichment purposes? You got to take their word for it, or how do you know?
Well, because you conduct intensive, very deep inspections. You talk to their scientists. In the case of Iraq, we had really, really broad authority to go anywhere we needed to, talk to anybody we wanted to. And it's true, between Iraq 1 and 2008, we found out that they did have a program, but they hadn't developed it enough. We saw the activities, we saw as far as they got in enrichment, we saw the very small scale research and development efforts on the weaponization part of it. There was no nuclear weapon, and we were out of Iraq for 4 years. So we went back in 2002 for 4 months, and were coming to the final conclusion that Iraq had not reconstituted any kind of a nuclear weapons program when the U.S. invaded Iraq, unfortunately, based on false intelligence.
So you said when you went into Iraq, you guys had full access. So regardless of the full access, they did everything they could do to try and prevent them getting bombed, basically.
One thing you need to know that most people don't, the IAEA doesn't prevent states from acquiring nuclear weapons. They simply verify that they are not doing it. And if they see indications that a state may be heading in the direction of a weapons program, they sound the alarm. So we saw in 2008 that whatever they had started down that nuclear path, they had stopped. And when we went back in 4 years later, we were able to ascertain that they hadn't gotten any further in any aspect of a weaponization program. And indeed, as I mentioned, the basis for going to war with Iraq was largely fear that they might be acquiring a nuclear weapon, and we had already ascertained that that wasn't the case. And sadly, some of the U.S. justification was based on false information, fabricated information.
Well, fabricated would be the right word, because I'm sure that our intelligence operation clearly said they didn't have nuclear capabilities.
Well, that's part of the problem. In fact, it always surprised me how there were two justifications for saying Iraq was continuing with a nuclear weapons program. They said that Iraq tried to buy uranium from Niger, and they presented some documents. We were able to ascertain that all of those documents were forgeries. So one basis out the window. The other was there were some aluminum tubes that were identified that nobody but one single analyst in the CIA thought was associated with enrichment. So, second justification out the window. The truth is, Iraq did not have a reconstituted nuclear weapons program between 2002 and 2003.
So when we bombed Iran recently, and President Trump came out and said we've destroyed all of their capabilities, do you believe that, or partially believe that, or what's your take on that?
The initial analyses that have come out, no, I don't believe that they have obliterated Iran's nuclear program. They have certainly damaged it. They've certainly damaged their enrichment capability. The Israelis also struck another site where they could have taken the enriched uranium, converted it into metal for use in a weapon. So, have they set back Iran's program? No question about it. Did they obliterate it? That's such a loose language. One of the most important things is we now do not know where that high enriched uranium is because, according to the information provided to the IAEA, the Iranians removed the high enriched uranium from the facility you've heard called Fordo. We don't know where it is. There were trucks that took it away from the facility, in all likelihood.
And that was recent. That was recent, right?
That was immediately after the strike that the satellite imagery of the couple days before came out, and that satellite imagery showed lines of trucks coming away from Fordo.
Wow.
The implication being they were removing the material because they knew something was about to happen.
I should mention that Laura is in Vienna, so we may get a little bit of interference on the line from Vienna, but we'll try to muddle through.
Yeah.
So when you guys went into Iraq, went in there to inspect their nuclear facilities, you were allowed full access. They gave you as much access as you needed because they wanted to do everything to prevent regime change, I would assume, and that's basically what this is all about, right? Every time they're worried about their own ass. They want to cover themselves. They don't want to be.
Certainly. Well, first of all, they gave us access because the Security Council said they had to, but they did it.
Security Council of the UN, correct?
Exactly. Sorry. The UN Security Council gave us that very, very broad access to which Iraq eventually agreed. So we had access everywhere we wanted to. And yes, of course, I'm certain that the Iraqis were mindful of the public assertions by the US government that regime change was necessary. Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. So obviously, they were trying to avert an attack on the country. And they were actually very cooperative with us between 2002 and 2003, hoping to head off a U.S. invasion of Iraq, which sadly they couldn't.
So do you think basically the U.S. government had made up their mind, regardless of what they were going to hear from your organization, that they were going in no matter what? Because
Nope, no question in my mind at all. I think they were waiting for, in fact, there was a UN Security Council resolution that was adopted in the fall of 2002 that said Iraq, you have to cooperate. And I think the US administration was anticipating that Iraq would not cooperate and it would give a semi-legitimate pretext for invading Iraq. And indeed, they were very cooperative. And the information that the US based its allegations on were forgeries, fabrications, and simply not relevant.
And
Do you think
go ahead.
Do you think President Bush was smart enough to make that decision, or do you think he had some help, aka
Uh,
Dick Cheney?
Well, we met several times with the people in the administration, the Bush administration, and it was very clear to me that they were convinced. Paul Wolfowitz, for example, was convinced that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program. And he once yelled at us across the table, "You can't mean to tell us you don't believe they have a nuclear weapon." And the response by both Blix and Albarrade was, "It's not our job to believe. It's our job to verify whether that's true or not." But they had clearly convinced themselves that Iraq had hidden not just nuclear, but other forms of weapons of mass destruction.
Wow. I have a question because in another interview you mentioned the forgeries and basically changing the wording when you delivered your information to the powers that be, and the wording was they pushed for, someone in your group or your group pushed for not authentic, and you felt like that was a you know
So yeah, here's the story. When Jacques Boat, who was the head of the Iran team, I keep doing this, that's terrible, was head of the Iraq team, he he figured out that these documents were forgeries. And when we were drafting the report for the Security Council, the UN Security Council, the phrase that was originally drafted was, "And these documents are forgeries." And I and one or two other people thought that that might be too inflammatory, that what we wanted to do was get across the point that these were not authentic, and that if we use the word forgery, it might it might derail it into if you will, a hysterical kind of conversation. The
wow.
important
Okay.
thing was to convey the message: these are bogus, and whether they were forgeries or a misunderstanding wasn't important. They just shouldn't serve the basis for an invasion. It was heartbreaking to see what came of that. And yes, I have regretted multiple occasions having pushed for that rather benign reference to non-authentic.
Got it. Okay.
And
Interesting.
for your efforts, you guys were awarded a Nobel Prize several years later, weren't you?
2005, Mohammed al-Baradei and the IAEA were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, yes. And I believe it was largely because Mohammed was willing to stand up to the U.S. government. Yeah.
So speaking of the U.S. government, now we have bombed Iran, Iran. Um, President Trump says we have obliterated all of the nuclear capabilities. What's your take on that?
Certainly, the Iran's nuclear capabilities have not been completely obliterated. Have they seriously damaged the two major enrichment facility sites that we know about? No question. Have they damaged the Esfahan Center, where Iran could have taken high enriched uranium, turned it into uranium metal for a weapon? Seriously damaged. But it's still not clear the extent to which both the two enrichment sites, Fordo and Natanz, have been the extent of the damage. It's no question that's been damaged quite a bit, and likely the centrifuges there are not operational at this point. One thing, here's a really nerdy aside. These centrifuges, once they start spinning, they cannot stop, but they cannot, if you will, they can't be unplugged, because if you do, they'll spin out of control and won't work anymore. So it's highly unlikely that in both of those instances, both Fordo and Natanz, that there would have been interruption in that spinning of the centrifuges. Here's the tricky thing, though. We don't know where the high enriched uranium is because Iran apparently removed it, at least from Fordo and Natanz, and we don't know where it is. Nobody knows where it is. And they very likely have other locations in the country where they could clandestinely reestablish their enrichment facilities or the enrichment capability. Again, we don't know where. And if the IAEA inspectors aren't allowed to do their full scale of inspections, it could be a long time before we figure out exactly what the situation is with Iran's nuclear program.
I have a real layman's question for you, Laura. I hope you excuse me. When you were talking before about, and American intelligence has talked about the trucks they saw outside the Iranian, how much, what does it take to move 60% of enrichment? Can you do it in a suitcase? Do you need a moving van? I mean, what does it take? I mean,
Good question.
Yeah, the level of enrichment isn't what makes it bigger or smaller. Okay, the high enriched uranium was 60% enriched, and I heard one of my former colleagues describe it as capable to remove it in a canister about the size of a keg.
Oh,
wow.
So
Okay.
I mean, it's dangerous, more from toxicity than radioactivity. It's just, you wouldn't want to inhale that stuff.
Right.
Not highly enriched, sorry, not highly radioactive. just with a lot of uranium-235 in it. So it is certainly not impossible to move. It's not even, I mean, you have to be careful. Wouldn't put it back of a truck or anything. I mean, like a normal truck, but movable, no question about it. It wasn't, as I think President Trump described it, as like massive and heavy and impossible to move. No, not true.
So the trucks
Not
really
true.
are
Shocking.
just they don't really mean anything. I mean, the fact that it was trucks there, because you don't need trucks to move.
Well, trucks, if you have a hell of a lot of that stuff, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had 400 kilograms of 60% enriched. 400 kilograms. Multiply that by 2.2. I think that gives you pounds. I'm not sure. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. So, and it may have been, knowing that they were going to be under attack, they were removing critical pieces of equipment as well. That probably not installed centrifuges, but if they had any centrifuges that hadn't been installed, maybe they were removing those as well. We see satellite imagery, but the only ones we've seen in public are the ones that show these parade of trucks. And Iran told the head of the IAEA, we have moved the material to a protective location.
Huh. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this was before the bombing or after?
I don't know when he was told that, whether
Okay.
he was told that before the bombing or after, but he mentioned it in his recent reports to the IAEA's, the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors.
Got it. So Netanyahu has essentially been, for the last 20, 30 years, proclaiming that Iran was very close to having nuclear capability. How true is that? Like how close were they in your estimation 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and 10 years ago? Because he's basically even 2 years ago.
Yeah. So Israel was firmly convinced that Iran was on a pathway to a nuclear weapon for a very long time. And in 2003, when it first came out about Iran's undeclared nuclear program, the U.S. analysis was at that time, 2003, remember, early 2003, that Iran had an organized, coordinated program for the production of nuclear material and the weaponization into a bomb. Okay. The U.S. analysis was, as of 2003, that Iran had gotten rid of that program, had dismantled that program. Now, why would they have done that? Well, what happened that year? The U.S. just invaded Iraq on the pretense of a nuclear weapons program. So you
Right.
could imagine the Iranians going, that's not such a good idea here. So they dismantled the organized program. Many of the activities that they continued to do, such as enrichment, are things that can indeed be misused for weapons purposes. And that's why it's so important to get the IAEA inspectors back in there to make sure we know what they're doing, how much material they're producing, where they're producing it, etc. And there's another aspect to this, and that is that the U.S. wouldn't have been in a position where it felt it needed to bomb these facilities if Donald Trump hadn't walked out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was in place from 2015. Up until that time, up until 2018, Iran was complying with the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and they were kept under constraints how much material they could produce, what levels of enrichment they could produce, and we had incredibly broad inspection rights because they were implementing what you referred to as the additional protocol. And when Trump walked out, it took Iran some time to stop cooperating. They did it in steps, hoping that eventually the U.S. would find its way back to the table. And it hasn't. Until now, President Trump is talking about, oh, we can have meetings with Iran now, but he's even said an agreement's not so important.
Yeah. The agreement's not that so
Right.
important.
I believe the Iranian parliament recently passed a bill stating that they would no longer cooperate with the IAEA.
subject to a decision by their National Security Council, a decision that hasn't yet been taken, at least as of the last time I checked the news. So
Right.
they haven't, they haven't pulled that trigger yet.
Do they?
Right.
What's the likelihood that they will, in your opinion?
I think it'll be a while before they allow the inspectors as much access as they're entitled to. I think it's going to be a bargaining chip, so to speak. Now, there's been some talk that they would even go further and withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I hate to bet against myself, but I don't think they will. I think the consequences of that would be immediate and severe. I don't think they will withdraw from the NPT and then remove the IAEA entirely from the country. But you have to kind of empathize a little bit with Iran, having just been bombed dramatically, that it might be a while before they'd want to come back to the table. And coming back to the table doesn't necessarily mean they're ready to give up enrichment. That was one of the real reasons the deal came off way back in 2005. The US pressed for not one centrifuge spinning, and the deal went to hell. And it wasn't until the JCPOA, when the United States realized they were going to enrich, let's cap it, let's make it, in effect, not usable for a weapons program. And less than 3 years later, Donald Trump removed the United States from that agreement.
So, I mean, isn't it very unlikely? I mean, I know some of the more radical thought thinkers in Iran think that the IAEA might have actually tipped Mossad into where the enrichment programs were going on, which is probably nonsense. But
Well, the existence of those enrichment facilities, the ones that we know about that have been declared by Iran, are not secret. Everybody knows where they are. They've been reported on for many years, many, many years. So I think what Iran has criticized the agency for is the report that the Director General produced, a couple of weeks ago. It was an in-depth assessment of where the IAEA was in its understanding of Iran's program. And it wasn't like the IAEA Director General said, I'm going to do this report. It was a report requested by the member states of the IAEA. And there were no surprises in there. I mean, Iran has known about all of these problems all along. Now, the question is, did Netanyahu use this as a basis for triggering its bombing in Iran? I think Iran was going to do it anyway. It just it it probably gave him the opportunity to say, see, even they believed it. But please keep in mind that board report didn't say that Iran had a nuclear weapons program. So
is the impetus for getting a nuclear weapon? It would seem to me, a layman, that it prevents regime change. I mean, everybody around them has got nukes, Iran, and they want to see it at the table. That's the way I would think, because it gives them a bargaining chip.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. Yeah.
there are lots of people who do a lot of analysis as to why any state would want to acquire a nuclear weapon. And unfortunately, North Korea is a good example of how it worked for them. Now, Libya, not so much. Iraq, not so much. They both went down the nuclear weapons route, and they were discovered soon enough that nothing came of it. But look at what happened to their leaders, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. It's not necessarily a safe route to your own security, to be perfectly frank.
Well, let's talk about the Ukraine. I mean, didn't the Ukraine agree not to build nukes? And we were supposed to
Actually,
support them, and now you got Trump in there saying maybe we're not going to support them, and
yeah. So Ukraine's a different situation altogether. Many years ago, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union posted some of its nuclear weapons on the territory of what is now Ukraine. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russians wanted to remove their nuclear weapons from Ukraine. They were never Ukraine's nuclear weapons. They were always Russia's nuclear weapons. And yes, nowadays there are a lot of Ukrainians who wish they hadn't. I frankly don't think that would have made Ukraine much safer. I think the real issue there is getting U.S. support for Zelensky, resuming an extensive support for Zelensky, not the acquisition of more nuclear weapons. More nuclear weapons isn't necessarily more secure.
Right. So I have a question about the sort of the
That didn't sound very satisfying, did it, Billy?
Well, I'm just thinking.
I
if
could
I'm
see
in
by the
a
look on your
position of
face.
power, I'm thinking, if I got a nuke, nobody's
yeah,
gonna
that's yeah.
nobody's gonna bomb me. It's that simple. I mean, because we're afraid of nuclear reaction. But so it seems like maybe it seems to me that they want it for not so much to bomb Israel. They want it because they want to see it at the table. They want to be in that position that they're one of the big boys too.
Actually, that's a really good question, I think.
I think that was almost certainly part of their thinking, part of their assessment about why they should go forward with a weapon. But listen to this. They decided in 2003 they weren't going to. So we were doing inspections there, and everything was more or less moving along, a little bit bumpy, but moving along. And if Trump hadn't walked out of the JCPOA, we wouldn't be where we are today. It was only after the US walked out of the JCPOA that Iran started working on its metallization program. The key part, because high enriched uranium, unless you turn it into metal, you can't put that gas in a bomb. You have to turn it into metal and then machine it. And more than that, I don't know, because I'm not a weapons person. But they started that in 2020, after they had tried to get the U.S. back to the table. To be honest, Iran's response to the U.S. walkout was very measured. But if you think that you're going to have an Israel that is more or less on the warpath, it wants regime change as much as some of the Iranians want regime change in Israel. You can imagine their military making a pretty strong argument for at least being as prepared as possible, being in a latency position. Now, if this hasn't pushed Iran closer to a nuclear weapon, it would be by the grace of God.
Yeah, I understand. Didn't the Ayatollah issue a fatwa? Is that what they call them? Fatwa that they're against mass destruction and against nuclear weapons, so you can't make them? Didn't
there's said to be a fatwa. I have heard different Islamic specialists describe that fatwa and the conditions under which it is applicable. I have heard it said, I do not know this to be the truth. I have heard it said that there are enough built-in exceptions that perhaps Iran could justify the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. Now, mind you, back in 2003, when this started heating up, one of the things that Mohammed el-Baradei, then the head of the IAEA, said to the Iranians was, look, if you just admit that you had a nuclear weapons program, you take your lumps, you move on, everything can be okay. And their response is, we can't admit to it. There's this fatwa. So whether that fatwa is real or an excuse, I can't say. It might be interesting to hear somebody who knows more about Islam talk about it. But yes, it's been used as an explanation as to why they aren't interested in a nuclear weapon and other WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Yeah.
So is it in your belief that if Iran had nuclear weapons, that they would not use them in a bullying way against Israel or the rest of the world?
I think it probably would have been a defensive mechanism. I don't think look at it this way. If they were to use a nuclear weapon on Israel, you don't think some of that fallout would affect them? I mean, not to mention the political and military fallout. I'm talking about radioactive fallout.
Yeah.
I, I'm, I've looked into this issue a lot. I think there's a better chance that nuclear weapons will be used by accident or in response to a mistake than it is that you'd have a rational military decision taken to actually use a nuclear weapon in the course of a war. I don't know.
Interesting.
So,
Huh.
so let me ask you another question, Laura, about states. You got regular states, countries that are, making, we hope, reasonable decisions on nuclear weapons. What about bad actors? Somebody who's not part of a state, terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. What's there any chance of them getting any small nuclear, whatever?
Highly unlikely. One of the toughest part about nuclear weapons is acquiring the nuclear material for a nuclear weapon. Pardon me, my cats decided to join us and talk about nuclear weapons.
Of course.
So nuclear material is very, very tightly controlled all around the world. Doesn't matter whether it's a nuclear weapon state or a non-nuclear weapon state. So that's why there are extra controls on nuclear material that aren't what we call safeguards. They're related to nuclear security, how to make sure that the material is protected from human beings as opposed to protecting human beings from the use of nuclear material. So yes, there's a chance that nuclear material can be stolen. And that is why measures are in place in almost every country that possesses nuclear material to prevent the theft of that material. And even if you get a hold of high enriched uranium, as I said, you have to have the knowledge, the technology, the wherewithal to metallize it, if you will. I'm sure. Sorry about that, Kitty.
That's all right.
She
That's
really wanted to be on this program.
So she's the one.
She's the one. Yeah.
I'm just moving my mouth. It's the cat that's talking.
So let me ask you again, at the risk of sounding anti-Semitic, I don't want to sound anti-Semitic of any such imagination, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty to begin with basically said the United States won't give aid to anybody who develops a nuclear weapon, right? But we've known Israel has had nuclear weapons for years and
No,
years, right?
actually, that's not what it says, Billy.
Okay.
That's not what it says. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a treaty that basically divides the world into two categories of countries. Those that have nuclear weapons, those that had nuclear weapons before 1967, of which there are 5, US, UK, France, Russia, and China. Everybody else in the world is considered a non-nuclear weapon state. Now, all 5 of the nuclear weapon states are parties to the NPT, and almost all other countries in the world are also parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as is Iran, as was North Korea. 3 countries have never joined: Israel, India, and Pakistan. So they are outside of what we call the non-proliferation regime. What does the NPT say about help from a nuclear weapon state? It simply says, I, nuclear weapon state, promise not to help any other country in the world develop nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean they can't provide assistance or technology or whatever. They just are prohibited from helping, for example, Israel build a nuclear weapon. And there's no indication that the US did help Israel build its nuclear weapons program. In fact, it was underground and contrary to the wishes of the United States that was originally developed.
So Israel was never part of
Interesting.
the Non-Proliferation Treaty to begin with. They never got in.
Nope.
So why isn't
Nope.
why isn't there no pressure on to make Israel join the Non-Proliferation Treaty because they already have nukes? Is that it? It's
Well, joining the NPT is a sovereign decision of countries. But to answer your question, there is pressure. There's a lot of pressure. You see it regularly among the member states, the non-nuclear weapon states that are members of the IAEA. The problem is there's no legal mechanism for forcing Israel, India, or Pakistan to the NPT table, so to speak. It's a sovereign decision each country can take.
But if the U.S. wanted them to join, couldn't they shut off the spigot of cash? I mean, isn't that pressure?
The U.S. wouldn't do that with Israel. I mean, look, they just helped them conduct a war.
Yeah.
They're not going to do that. It's not likely.
Right.
So the standard is beyond belief. I mean, it's
So, what country, if any, is the biggest nuclear threat at this time?
Biggest nuclear. The country most likely to use a nuclear weapon or to develop a nuclear
that's a
weapon.
good point.
To use a nuclear weapon until the country that can develop a nuclear weapon can enter into the fray.
Yeah, I worry about the nuclear weapons in the United States and Russia, not because I think, well, I used to not think that there would ever be a rational decision to use them. North Korea, they're not an irrational actor, but if Kim feels threatened, it's possible that he would be prepared to suffer the consequences of using a nuclear weapon. Again, I think his desire for life exceeds his desire to use a nuclear weapon. There are a couple of other countries about which people have spoken with concern. Saudi Arabia was one of them. Myanmar was another one. Now, Saudi Arabia's NPT, they have the safeguards agreement, and they now hopefully will have an additional protocol as well. So I don't see any country immediately that we're worried about developing a nuclear weapons program. There's no new countries that I'm aware of that we're deeply concerned about.
So,
Myanmar, still not clear.
who do you think is making decisions in the United States? Is it Donald Trump? Is it J.D. Vance? Is it Marco Rubio? Or who?
Wow,
Donald
Frank's
Trump.
getting
Or
Donald
it's
Trump.
solely Donald Trump.
Well, look at the DIA assessment that came out. First of all, his own Tulsi Gabbard comes out and says, okay, it's the Intel community's assessment that Iran isn't going forward with a nuclear weapon. And Trump goes, yeah, she's obviously not telling the truth. And you go, it's his own appointee.
Why
It's
not
his own
fire her?
appointee. I mean,
If he doesn't trust her,
get
why not
serious.
get rid of him? It's ridiculous.
Then you have a post-attack assessment. What do they call it? Post-attack assessment by the DIA of the United States of America that says, well, they wouldn't necessarily use the word obliterate, but we may have set them back a few months. Trump doesn't believe it. It's his own administration. And if he finds uncomfortable information, he simply chooses to call it false. That's his approach to information that makes him uncomfortable.
I really find your answer to Frank's question fascinating. You said you're more concerned about the U.S. and Russia with their nuclear facility. I would think that they're rational actors. I mean, I would think. So, can you
You'd like to
elaborate? Why are
think.
you more concerned about them than, a rogue country getting it? We consider a rogue country.
Because I think we're talking about leaders of two incredibly powerful countries who have axes to grind. And we've seen Donald Trump misrepresent the truth. Isn't that a nice way of saying lying?
Yes.
Misrepresent the truth. And look at Putin. He wants more than anything to win this war in Ukraine, and it's going badly for the Russians. So there was some question a year or so ago that maybe Russia might use a small tactical nuke to frighten Ukraine into submission. Even talk like that is terrible, and it's become more common that we talk about those things, which is frightening in and of itself. That we should talk about that as even a remote possibility.
So, Laura, let me ask you. You've been out of this country now for 40 years, for all extent and purposes. What you're basically sort of a neutral observer of the world as it is. What's your assessment of Putin?
What's the assessment of what? I think he's a brilliant tactician. I think he misjudged Ukraine. I think he will move heaven and earth to subjugate Ukraine, and I personally don't think he'll stop there. Frankly.
Wow.
Wow.
No.
So you don't think it has anything to do with the infringement on the borders of Ukraine being accepted into the group of nations that he didn't want them to be accepted in. You don't think it has anything to do with that?
I didn't say that. I
Okay.
think that probably, yeah, I think that probably contributed to it. But I
Okay.
think he's a megalomaniac, and that's maybe a little too facile. He is a big believer in the mother Russia, and perhaps wants a more reunified Soviet Union under a different name. So I don't think his quest for power will stop at Ukraine. Was it rationally bothering the Russians that Ukraine was moving closer to NATO? Sure, sure, it would. But I don't think that explains it. I think it was a convenient excuse for him to use.
Let me
Okay.
ask you a question, Laura. That if Russia obviously felt threatened, like they were going to get invaded themselves, the nuke would always be an option. I mean, if you get backed into a corner, they're going to use whatever they have. Is there a way out for us? I mean, is it better for the United States to have the war prolonged? Because if Putin gets pushed into a corner, we give too much assistance to Ukraine that he might use a limited nuke. Is there a way out?
Continuation of any war is never the answer. It's never a good answer. The best way out of this is diplomacy and negotiations, and that goes for the Ukraine situation. It goes for the Iran situation. You have to sit down and talk for a long-term resolution of conflict. Military doesn't do it, and in the process, the cost is really, really high. So
How do you
that's my
get
take
Iran
on it.
back to the
There's no
table?
such thing as a good
How
war.
do you get Iran
with
back to
two
the table after 2 weeks? We say we're going to bomb him, but we'll make a decision in 2 weeks. He bombs them the next day. He tears up the contract. How do you make a contract with somebody who's not going to abide by the contract? Why would they come back to the table?
Excellent question.
Wh-
I don't have a good answer to that. No,
I-
I do. I do. And that is because ultimately you believe that regardless of how bad your enemy is, that it's in your interest to try to negotiate a peaceful settlement, a negotiated peaceful settlement.
But with Putin and Trump, do you believe there can be any diplomacy with other people other than Putin and Trump directly talking to each other?
I think they're both key players. You know, uh,
I mean,
I don't know.
I don't believe that either of them listen to anybody. So if they're not listening to anybody, they have to sit across from the table and have the discussions themselves and hash it out.
Well, that was, I'm sure, what Trump thought he was going to be able to do when he took office, when he said he would settle the Ukraine war on the first day, because he likes to see himself as very close to Vladimir Putin. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. And in fact, I think you've seen Trump express some kind of irritation with Putin at not having been willing to sit down and talk about a peaceful solution to Ukraine. Do they have to talk? Yes. Eventually, they're key players. Indeed, Russia was part of the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for Iran. They played a critical role in getting Iran to the negotiating table. Now, the Ukraine war sort of changed that dynamic, and since then, Iran has been selling drones to Russia. Russia has been less willing to press Iran to come to the table. So it all gets a little bit complicated. The reason the JCPOA was so successful is we got all the big and necessary players together to agree with Iran on an approach. You had all of the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states and Germany. You had the EU behind it. And, well, we're where we are because that fell apart. And you also have shifting political alliances, which have further complicated it.
I want to ask you another question about the morality of us dropping the 2 big eggs on the Iran nuclear facilities, the 3 big eggs. Oh, how many there were? Are we at risk of exploding a dirty bomb in essence in that country? I mean, suppose the nuclear facilities were blown apart. Does that become a dirty bomb then? I mean,
So, morality, I think it was illegal, profoundly illegal. I was against the UN Charter, against human rights. I mean, it was profoundly illegal. Moral, I don't find it right either. Now, what you're asking is a technical question. Could they have released radiation by bombing these facilities? Now, the problem with an enrichment facility is really not its radiation. Uranium hexafluoride, UF6, is highly toxic. Would it have gotten out far outside of the nuclear facility? Unlikely. So, a very limited radiation risk, some toxicity, poisonous, right? But probably localized. What you worry about is if you have an operating nuclear power plant or a research reactor where you're actually creating radiation all the time, which is why the Israelis will not bomb the Bushehr nuclear power plant.
They won't bomb what nuclear
Google it.
power plant? I'm sorry.
The Bushehr, the Iranian nuclear power plant, because it's operational. And the Israelis in the past, when they have bombed nuclear facilities, they do it before the introduction of nuclear material, actually to avoid that very situation.
Wow.
So Bushehr is safe. The Israelis aren't going to go after it. Plus, they're not really the proliferation risk. That's
Right.
not really where the risk is. So bombing Natanz, Fordo, Esfahan, unlikely that it would have created a Chernobyl it certainly wouldn't have created a Chernobyl kind of situation.
But it's actually comforting that you just said that they do take that into consideration, that they might explode a dirty bomb. I mean, that's at least comforting to me anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even in the case of Iraq, when they first bombed the Osirak reactor, in the case of Syria, when they bombed the facility in the middle of the desert, they did so, according to their officials, before the Syrians could introduce nuclear material to the reactor, because he didn't want to wait until afterwards where there would be a serious problem.
Wow.
Well, the countries
So there's
that
some bright news. There's some bright news in this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the biggest keys is the likelihood of some rogue actor and a dirty bomb being, brought to the U.S. or some other country is you're saying is unlikely. So I think that's comforting. I'm not, and I'm sure you're not saying that it's not possible at all, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, and let me be clear. There's a difference between a nuclear weapon,
right,
and a dirty bomb.
Yeah, I guess.
A nuclear weapon, think of the mushroom cloud, right?
Yeah.
A dirty weapon can be something as simple as a cobalt-60 sample that you've gotten from a hospital, and you detonate it in the middle of New York City. You blow it up with TNT.
Okay.
Because it's a terrorist action. It's not because it's going to create a nuclear reaction. It's toxic, it's dirty, and radioactive as hell.
And how much damage could that do? Or how big a bomb explosion?
More the fear factor. And it depends on how big your sample is, how big how much TNT. I'm not sure that's even the right term for it, how much dynamite you're using, how much explosive material you're using. But it depends fundamentally on how much of this radioactive material. It doesn't have to be nuclear material. Cobalt-60 is not nuclear material. You see it in hospitals. They use it for cancer diagnosis, treatment, that sort of thing. There's a bigger risk that kind of thing might happen than that a nuclear weapon would be stolen by a terrorist.
So Mission Impossible is not going to happen anytime soon.
I haven't seen the latest one, but I sure hope not.
Yeah.
So what's next for the U.S. and Iran? Where does this go?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because Iran isn't willing to surrender. Not surprising. They're also not willing to give up on any kind of enrichment activity. And President Trump has announced that fundamentally, if Iran doesn't go to its knees, or if it continues to enrich or conduct its nuclear activities, that the bombing will continue. So I hope that they are actually able to sit down and have some negotiations about where to go from here. If we're lucky, we'll get JCPOA too. But it's going to take a tremendous amount of discipline and luck and goodwill for that to actually happen.
Well, you were talking before about we were both talking about regime change and why they would want a nuclear weapon to prevent regime change. Is that possibly Netanyahu's motivation as well? I mean, he's not in a great political place. Does he think that by getting the U.S. involved in Iran and taking out their nuclear facilities is preventing him from getting reelected or regime change as well?
Well, interesting that you asked that. I don't think it's a little bit more subtle than that. I think Netanyahu's role in the Gaza war, personally, I find it reprehensible. And I think one of the reasons he keeps at this is ostensibly because he wants to, level Gaza, which he's come pretty close to doing. But he's doing it to avoid going to prison. He's like
Oh,
Trump. He's
wow.
been accused of crimes. And this is a way,
Wow.
so long as he stays in office, they can't put him in jail. And
Holy
so
crap.
he prolongs this this conflict in Gaza, which is devastating. Talk about
Right.
inhumane and immoral. And then, in order to and there was a big split within the Israeli population about how he's handling that Gaza war. So one quick way to unify the country is to look to an outward enemy. This is not just a Netanyahu technique. It's been used by leaders
Even here.
forever. Yeah. So there are a lot of Iranians who may not support Netanyahu, but they certainly don't want to see Iran acquire a nuclear weapon. The problem is Iran wasn't close to acquiring a nuclear weapon, but it became a good excuse and you rally around the flagpole. So the end result of this is, yes, it means no regime change from Netanyahu, but not in the most direct way that you're thinking of. It's create a conflict that distracts the public. We've seen it before.
So ultimately, then it's the same old story. So people are dying for basically because the leaders are on a rampage for their own interests, essentially.
I'm
sorry to say, Derek. Yep, we're there
Wow.
again.
I think you hit it right on the button. I was watching a YouTube of Noam Chomsky, and he was talking about Gaza and what's going on, and you hear all the collateral damage and all that nonsense. He was talking about children that was shot point blank in the head in Gaza. Going on.
That's not collateral. That's intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I have a question about regime change. Sorry, Billy, did I cut you off?
no, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a friend who's from Iran. He moved here. He's my age now. He moved here 27 years ago. So, and he's under the belief that, well, having lived in the country, that the people of Iran actually would like a regime change. And you also, and I'm not asking for war or asking for a regime change, but he's under the belief that the current state of Iran is not it's not as good as it could be and as good as it should be, and the current regime is very repressive. What do you think about that?
I completely agree with him. If
Okay.
you remember, back when the JCPOA was announced, the country, Iran, was on fire in such a positive way. They were celebrating in the streets. They were like going to be re-engaged in the global community. The Iranian people are, by and large, highly educated, very cultivated people. They have been part of the global economy in the past. They don't want to be isolated. Now, I've not seen polls because I'm not sure you'd get a good poll coming out of Iran right now. Is it a repressive regime? Of course. When a woman can be killed because she doesn't wear a hijab, I call that repressive. So, yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of people, Iranian people residing in Iran, who don't like the regime. Now, what has Netanyahu conveniently done?
Yeah.
Unified the Iranian people. They don't want to see regime change coming from outside. So, voila.
Wow.
Mistake number two.
Yeah, I could see how
Wow.
that would definitely unify them. I mean, because I've met a few Iranians myself, and they never could call themselves Iranians. They usually call themselves Persians. And the amount of pride that the Persian people have is tantamount to taking a Texan and times it by 100 about Texas, because so their pride is absolutely enormous. I mean,
And with good reason.
yeah, of course, Persian Empire. I mean, we're around 250 years. They've been around. Persian Empire was thousands of years. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is definitely going to cause them to.
Unify.
You've been around the Middle East. You've been all over it. I always had the impression that Iran was very liberal. I remember seeing pictures of kids in Iran wearing M&M T-shirts. They were fairly liberal. Well, Saudi Arabia makes Iran look like Greenwich Village in the '60s. If you want to talk about repression.
Well, I've never been to Saudi Arabia, so it's hard for me to speak from personal
But you found the
impression.
Iranian people very liberal, very educated.
By and large, very well educated, very cultivated, and by and large also want to. Many of them are very Western. A lot of the Iranian scientists were educated in the UK and the US. These are people who want a better life, and you know, without suggesting that I know what the poll results might be in Iran, I would think most of them would rather not have a repressive regime.
There was a U.S.
Unfortunately,
reporter.
that's what they have.
There was a U.S. reporter in a diner or a coffee shop or whatever in Iran at 9/11 when 9/11 happened, and he made a point of saying that one of the Iranians in the cafe stood up, walked over to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, "We're all Americans today," which people are people, and that gives me a lot of hope for Iran. I mean, but again, this bombing seems to me taking the opposite direction.
I share that view. I share that view, Billy.
So essentially, so we're basically in a situation where we have uh, the people of Iran controlled by a regime that is repressive. Netanyahu, the people of Israel, are also essentially controlled by a person who's, maybe they're able to freely move about the country, but ultimately he has thrown his country into war now. So we're fighting a war that's completely unnecessary and essentially happening because, well, mostly because Netanyahu's trying to keep himself out of jail, and the Iranians don't want. Well, the current regime doesn't want to be changed.
Based on what you're just saying, how is that different than the United States?
Excellent question, Frank.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Well, can't answer that other than
Exactly.
yeah.
Look yourself in the mirror, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have another question. So, U.S., China, France, Russia, UK, and the other countries that actually have nuclear power.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons. Sorry. Yeah. How did they get to that state? So, and I know they all got to their position of nuclear weapons in a different way, I suppose. But is there some sort of committee that got most of them there, or did they get there in secret? How does it normally happen?
I'm not sure there's a norm.
Okay.
People are citing things like, well, the U.S. did it within a matter of a couple of years. So they tested the first device in 1945. 4 years later, the Soviet Union joined the club. I think it's within 20 years you had the 5 nuclear weapons states coming about. They did it in different ways, but in relatively short periods of time. Israel, there are lots of books published about this. Certainly, the Israelis don't confirm or deny that they have any nuclear weapons. And I don't know enough about the history of their program. India, Pakistan, they have very exceptional scientists. It may it may come from they've got it, we want it, but frequently what starts it is some sort of sense of a conflict. I
Right.
have an enemy, and rightly or wrongly, I want my military to develop this because it mutually assured destruction. Does deterrence actually work? We don't know. I mean, luckily, we haven't had a use of nuclear weapon, but it's justified on this idea that if I have nukes, nobody will use nukes against me. But that's how the US and the Soviet Union got into so much trouble, just building, 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 building. It doesn't take 10 nuclear weapons to kill an enemy, right?
Right.
So, but there are people that have been writing for decades on why states acquire nuclear weapons. And I'm not a specialist in that area. I just try to make sure they don't.
Okay, so right. So okay, so Iran, how are these other countries able to get to um n- I keep messing up the phrase nuclear power to what's
To
the other
nuclear
phrase?
weapons.
Nuclear
Nuclear
weapons.
weapons.
How are they able
Yeah.
to get to nuclear weapons? How come Iran hasn't been able to do that, but let's say India has, and Pakistan has, China has? So because I don't think it's a lack of intellectual capacity.
No, no, here's the deal. So that
Okay.
was why the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated, because at some point in the mid 1960s, it became clear after the Cuban Missile Crisis that it would be a really bad idea if more countries had nuclear weapons. Now,
Okay.
there's part of this good old boy club. We've got the weapons. We don't want anybody else to get them. But I think that was a damn good judgment. So,
Right.
most states in the world have since then become parties to the NPT, and the non-nuclear weapon states, the states that don't have nuclear weapons, promise not to get them in exchange for peaceful nuclear technology, uh, trade, that sort of thing, health, agricultural assistance using radiological techniques. So India, Israel, and Pakistan never became party to that treaty. They have never legally said, I promise not to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran did, and they breached that promise, at least in their initial efforts to go down that route. North Korea clearly breached that obligation, but they withdrew from the NPT um, a couple of decades ago. So the difference is a legal one, and people might go, but it's just legal. But that's profoundly important when you have a global legal infrastructure. You don't just go, oh, it doesn't matter. It does, it matters. And we're
Right.
now in a situation where multilateralism is really under fire. And that's really frightening, where the
So
rule of law isn't being adhered to.
Well,
I gotta make a turn here. You grew up. We went to school at Berkeley. Your sister Jane was famous for the posing with a daisy in her mouth with a guy pointing a gun at her in the '60s. How do you think? Where did you make this turn? Where did you come out of the '60s and become a general counsel for nuclear proliferation?
not
I mean,
Totally by accident. I was working for the US Department of Energy as a lawyer, working on radiation injury cases, the uranium miners cases, the uranium miners who got sick from working in the mines, digging up this stuff that was serving the weapons purposes. And I was offered a job in Vienna, Austria, with an organization about which I knew nothing, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I was tasked with working on nuclear non-proliferation. And I had to be a pretty quick study because I didn't know anything about it before I joined. But it's been a fascinating experience ever since then. And I'm really a believer in non-proliferation.
well.
well, do you believe that may go back to being at Berkeley, a very liberal environment? Uh, that's where your peace, your left wing philosophy took over.
I don't think most people who are left wing would consider me even remotely left wing. When I was at Berkeley, I sure wasn't considered left wing, more middle of the road.
Middle of
And I know a lot of conservative people who don't believe that there should be more nuclear weapons in the world either. I don't think you have to be a left wing nutcase to think that nuclear weapons aren't good for humans.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, Frank.
I didn't mean to imply you were a left wing case.
Well,
So excuse me. I think we've gotten so caught up in left wing, right wing, we forget that most of the world is middle of the road, and we've got to find some way to get the left wing and the right wing out of our politics and more toward the middle of the road.
Absolutely, Frank.
and,
Absolutely. Yep.
I keep going back to what you said earlier about you're more concerned about Russia and the United States, uh, which we used to consider stable actors. But now you're talking about two guys like Netanyahu and Trump trying to stay out of jail, And then you got Putin, who's an egomaniac, possibly sociopathic, I don't know, but you got three massive egos. And we're all affected by their massive egos. I mean, seems like they'll
One
listen
of the
to anybody.
things One of the things that could help address that is take another look at the U.S. command and control structure. How is it that one single person can trigger the use of a nuclear weapon? And that's in the form of Donald Trump. That doesn't scare you. It should.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of people in our business have been looking into ways you could build in more fail-safe mechanisms so that you can't have a single person triggering a nuclear war.
You know, we've talked about this, but we have never mentioned where Great Britain stands, where Germany stands, where French stands, where Spain stands, where Portugal stands. Where does the rest of Europe stand on all of this?
You know, interesting question. I've been talking about this with a lot of people here in Vienna. We had a conference yesterday where a lot of the local diplomats attended, and the big discussion was, why isn't Europe pushing back against, for example, the bombing of Iran or the tariff wars that Trump has been waging? I I don't have a good answer to that question, Frank. I think because the US is so powerful that and Trump is so unpredictable, and this is something that he uses. He's unpredictable, so people are wary of him, and that's what he uses to control not just human beings but governments. And he's been, let's say, in his view, pretty effective at doing that.
What about the fact that do you think any of the instability in Europe as it pertains to like immigration and economy, do you think any of that has to do with the fact that Europe is not really weighing in on the situation as hardly as they normally would? Because it seems like you know, from living in the U.S. and looking at the media in the U.S., it does seem like places like Paris and Spain and some parts of Italy are dealing with a lot of external issues that they wouldn't normally have to deal with. Is that
I
not
don't.
true?
I think there are serious immigration issues. I don't think that's what's keeping them quiet on these issues, to be
Okay.
honest. Europe is, turning a bit more to the right than I would like to see it. And a
Mhm.
large part of it is associated with this really massive immigration. But where does it all start? We're not addressing the reasons for this immigration. It's the lack of food security, the wars that are going on, the poverty in the rest of the world. And if we don't start addressing those, these waves of immigration to wealthier countries are going to continue. And so I think it's been, instead of being proactive and trying to address the root causes, we're trying to build walls as fast as we can to keep the people out. I think it's a misplaced expenditure of funding, if you will.
Right. And why do you think there's instability in the other places, the places that lack food insecurity and are having migrants leave their countries and come to Europe? I'm
Civil
curious of
war,
your. Okay.
yeah, civil war, poverty. These are countries, a lot of them in Africa, Afghanistan. It's just no kind of life to live. Palestinians, why do they want to get out of that area? Obviously, Africa, it's poverty and war. It's poverty
Right.
and war.
What causes
And do
some
you
of
think that the Western countries are somewhat responsible for the instability in those countries?
In some cases, directly.
Yeah.
In some cases, absolutely directly. But
Yeah.
again, does pointing figures help? No. What we need to do is have a collective action. For example, making sure that these countries have energy, that they have clean water, that they have food supplies. Um, you know, Even if they're countries that we don't particularly like their leaders, um, we need to approach this from a more humanitarian perspective. There's your left-wing nutcase coming out, Frank.
You could make the case in
I,
Central America as well. I mean, why do people flock out of
Yes,
Central America?
yes.
We screwed up Central America, South America, We on our hands
Yeah.
propping up dictators, then, their life is bad. What causes somebody to walk 1,000 miles or 1,500 miles for a better life? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously what they're leaving behind is worse. They don't even know what to expect. Desperation.
Yeah.
Laura, do you have to run? Laura,
Yeah.
I do.
do you have to?
Yeah.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
thank you for being a part of this
I've enjoyed it.
discussion. We really have found it enlightening because, in my case, it was nuclear proliferation for dummies. And, I'm not speaking for Billy or Derek because they're a little bit more versed than I am. But thank you so
Laura,
much for being here.
I'd just like to say, Laura, we could talk to you for weeks to pick your brain. It's
Yeah.
been fascinating. And thank you so much, so much. And of course, we're all worried about
Anytime.
our grandkids and children, and it's nice to shed a little light on the situation. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Really.
My pleasure. Great to see you
Derek,
guys.
do you need us?
Next week's guest.
We'll see you next week.